a few things that I want us all to be on the same page about. First is that this workshop is in no way, shape, or form covering all of the extremely complex issues and intersectionalities that exist when we are talking about race, talking about homelessness, or talking about both of them. That being said, I'm also not an expert in the topic, and if any point in this presentation I say something inaccurate, hurtful, stupid in any way, please feel free to interrupt me and let me know. I am here to learn like all of you. This being said, this is also going to be a pretty short presentation. We're not going to go super in depth with any of these topics just because I have an hour. And these are extremely complex issues that deserve all the time in the world. But unfortunately, today we only have an hour. So I will do my best. And then hopefully at the end, we will have time to discuss. And I encourage everyone to get engaged at the end, and so we can learn from each other. Okay, next, the most important thing that I want us to be on the same page about is some definitions, just so we know what we're talking about. So the first term I have is just race. Can anybody here in this call tell me what they think the definition of race is? Feel free to unmute yourself, use the chat, whatever tickles your pickle. What do you guys define as race? Anybody? Nobody? I do have the power to call on someone. Martin says skin tone. Yes. Geetha, if you want to hit next really quick. So race is a social construct. Yes, Sarah. Race is a social construct that is based on an individual's physical characteristics. So that is usually their skin tone. For some reason, that is what we think race should be. But it can be skin color, eye shape, physical characteristics like that. And some examples of races are, Black, white, and Asian. And there's way more, but those are just a couple examples. The next term that I want us to all be on the same page about is ethnicity, just so that we know the difference between race and ethnicity. I know that's something that gets kind of confused often, but does anybody want to tell me what they think ethnicity means? Anybody?
You are more than welcome to just unmute yourself and shout out any answer you want to shout out.
What Geetha said.
I think ethnicity is more of like origin and like family background. Yeah, Gabby and Madeline said in the chat.
Exactly. So ethnicity is more about a common culture or a common practice or common, whatever. And then some examples of that are Italian, Chinese, Nigerian, Filipino. These are more, they can be geographical, they can be culture-based, they can be religion-based. But that is what an ethnicity is, and that is how it differs from race. The last definition that I want to ask you guys about is systemic. I know we've all heard this word before when we talk about systemic issues, systemic this, systemic that, but what does systemic mean? Can anybody tell me? No? Okay, this one's a little tricky. Geetha, if you could just, okay, cool. So systemic is the word we use to describe a phenomenon, usually a social problem that affects every single part of an entire system. A systemic problem is a problem that is due to inherent issues in the system rather than specific individual factors. And basically what this means is that systemic issues are issues that are built into the system. They are there because someone somewhere wanted them to be there. They are built in, and they are not in any way like special cases. They are supposed to be there, unfortunately. All right, so next slide. I want to talk about the system. What are we talking about? What is the system when we talk about systemic? What is this elusive system that we all blame all of these issues on? Well, first we have to define what a system is, and I won't make y'all guess on this one. A system is a government or social organization that has control over people's lives. And some examples of this are the criminal justice system, the American education system, the healthcare system. There's so many more other systems. And if anyone can come up with some examples, I would love to hear them. Drop them in the chat. But yeah, that is the definition of what a system is. Cool. So we got that. A system is an organization that controls and affects people's lives. Well, where did these systems come from? What I'm about to say is a point that I really want to hammer home because it's so easy for us to blame all of the injustices we see on the broad existence of a system, the system. But when we talk about systemic issues, it's really, really important to remember that these systems are not naturally occurring. Systems, the criminal justice system, American education system, they don't just grow out of the ground. They don't just manifest out of thin air. They are intentionally and carefully created by people, by human beings. And there's so many reasons why they are created. But the point is that they're here and they exist. And they are created by people who benefit from them. And they're further supported and upheld by more people who benefit from them. And the problem with that is that not everyone benefits equally from all of these systems, if at all. And more times than not, the very few who are able to have these benefits do so on the backs of other people, which is not okay. And this is really important because while a lot of injustices are products of unjust systems, these systems are put in place and backed by human beings, by people. And so by making this connection between systems and people, we can understand that these systems themselves are not responsible for injustice, but the people who intentionally created, continue to create, continue to enforce, continue to uphold these racist and discriminatory systems. They are the ones responsible. On the bright side, because people created these systems, people like us who have the capacity to recognize the injustices that exist also have the same power to strive to create more just systems. And so in my head, I kind of think of it like a virus, not COVID. We're not going to talk about COVID. But when we engage in discussion or activism, I think it's super important to understand, address, and work against issues like we're talking about today, like race and homelessness, as the symptoms, while simultaneously being able to identify and work against the source of the systems. And so the people, the institutions that create these systems. I know I keep saying that, but it's really important to, at the same time, be able to address both. And so I really want to hammer home that the system did not create itself. People did. And so that is the source that we're trying to address. Alrighty, I know that was kind of depressing and that was a lot, but now that we're all on the same page, or I hope we're on the same page, we can get into it. If anyone has any questions, is confused by anything I just said, feel free to interrupt me, drop it in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with. But getting into it, what is the problem? Well, the problem is that most minority groups, especially Black and Indigenous groups, experience homelessness at disproportionately high rates. And this is due to longstanding historical and structural racism in the United States of America. On the next slide, we have a chart. And this chart shows us the disproportion between the homeless population and the general population by race. So if we look closely here, I know it might be a little blurry, but we can see that Black Americans represent 13.4% of the population overall in this country, but they represent almost 40% of the homeless population. And that is, my friends, the definition of disproportionate. Same with Hispanic or Latinx people and Indigenous people, disproportionate in different rates of disproportion. And so we can see that the largest disproportion exists in our Black communities. And then on the flip side, all the way at the end, we can see how white people experience homelessness at also disproportionate rates, but the other way around. And so that is the definition of inequality. And so ideally, in the ideal world, there would be no yellow bars on this chart. There would be no homeless population. And in a world where things were all proportionate, all of the yellow bars would be the same height as the blue bars. But they are not, and we do not live in a world where that exists yet. But I hope that soon, one day, we will. So what's going on? Why is this happening? Well, historical and present discriminatory practices around housing, land use, property rights, criminal justice, and healthcare have made home ownership and wealth accumulation utterly inaccessible for many people of color. Going all the way back to the genocide of many indigenous people, the enslavement of Black people, Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, the police, all of these things, and so many more. These are results of a deliberately racist system that have made it so that communities of color have always disproportionately experienced homelessness and housing insecurity. And due to these racist housing policies, white families have been able to accumulate much more wealth than their Black and brown counterparts, with a typical white family owning 10 times the wealth of the typical Black family and 7 times that of the typical Latinx family. And this doesn't just affect people on an individual level, but on the community level as well. When communities face disinvestment and a lack of wealth, families and communities are less able to support their family members and community members who are experiencing homelessness or are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And if you go to the next slide, we can see that this problem is even worse when we look at Black Americans in particular. Black Americans make up 12% of the US population, like we saw on that chart earlier, 26% of the poverty population, and over 40% of the homeless population. And this overrepresentation in poverty and homelessness is, like I said earlier, the legacy of slavery, Jim Crow, intentional discrimination in housing, employment, education, the criminal justice system, the judicial system, as well as the mass incarceration of Black people for seemingly no reason. And so that is not okay. And that is the problem that we're here to talk about. All right, moving on. We're going to talk about housing discrimination. There's a lot of policy that goes into housing discrimination and analyzing like the complexities of housing discrimination, all the way from redlining to segregation, the rapid cost of living going up. Housing discrimination against people of color has a really deep systemic history, structural history. And so in order to understand this, I have a video up next for us to watch because NPR does it better than I ever could. And they do it in 6 minutes. It probably took me like a year. So we're just gonna go ahead and watch this really quick and then we'll talk about it.
You know what's so sad, man? You know what's wild? Martin Luther King stood for nonviolence. Now what's Martin Luther King? A street. And I don't give a fuck where you in America. If you're on Martin Luther King Boulevard, there's some violence going down.
That, of course, is Chris Rock's famous joke about streets named for Martin Luther King Jr., which tend to be in, let's say, distressed areas. And he's not wrong, because if you look at the way housing segregation works in America, you can see how things ended up this way. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Okay, let's look at MLK Boulevard in Baltimore. I want to show you how to see housing segregation in schools, in health, in family wealth, in policing. But first, an explanatory comma. It's the 1930s in the wake of the Great Depression. FDR is president. He wants to bring economic relief to millions of Americans through a collection of federal programs and projects called the New Deal. One part of that New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934, which introduced ideas like the 30-year mortgage and low fixed interest rates. So now you have all these lower income people who can afford homes. But how do you make sure they don't default on their new mortgages? Enter the Homeowners Loan Corporation. The HOLC created residential security maps, and these maps, they're where the term redlining comes from. Green meant best area, best people, aka businessmen. Blue meant good people like white-collar families. Yellow meant a declining area with working class families, and red meant detrimental influences, hazardous, like foreign-born people, low-class whites, and most significantly, Negroes. Again and again on these HOLC maps, one of the most consistent criteria for redline neighborhoods is the presence of Black and brown people. Let's be clear, studies show that people who lived in redlined areas were not necessarily more likely to default on their mortgages, but redlining made it difficult, if not impossible, to buy or refinance. So landlords abandon their properties, city services become unreliable, in most places, crime increases, and property values drop. All of these conditions fester for 30 years as white people flee to the brand new suburbs popping up all over the country. Many of those suburbs institute rules called covenants that explicitly forbid selling homes to Black people, and all of this was perfectly legal. Now it's 1968, and MLK is assassinated.
Good evening. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39
Apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot
Martin
to death.
Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
In the aftermath, Congress passes the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It's a policy meant to encourage equal housing opportunities regardless of race or religion or national origin, and it offers protections for future homeowners and renters, but it does little to fix the damage already done. Over the next 50 years, the Fair Housing Act is rarely enforced. So you can still see housing segregation and its effects in Baltimore and often along any MLK Boulevard in any U.S. city, like its effects on wealth. So home ownership is the major way Americans create wealth, right? Well, discrimination in housing is the major reason that Black families, up and down the income scale, have a tiny fraction of the family wealth that white families do, even white families with less education and lower incomes. For almost 30 years, 98% of FHA loans were handed out to white borrowers. Not only were Black neighborhoods redlined, and not only was the Fair Housing Act selectively enforced, if at all, but it is still, today, much harder for a Black person to get a mortgage or home loan than it is for a white person.
Families are fearful of speaking up about a basic human right that should be afforded to everyone in the world, but definitely in the richest country in the world.
And housing segregation in schools. The primary way that Americans pay for public schools is by paying property taxes. People who live in more valuable homes have better funded local schools, better paid teachers, better school facilities, and more resources. Here's the feedback loop. The better the schools in a neighborhood, the more those homes in that neighborhood are worth. And the higher the property values of those homes, the more money there is for schools, and so on and so on. And housing segregation in health. Because of urban planning that benefited those richer, whiter neighborhoods, people of color are more likely to live near industrial plants that spew toxic fumes. They're more likely to live far away from grocery stores with fresh food, and in places where the water isn't drinkable. They're more likely to live in neighborhoods with crumbling infrastructure and in homes with toxic paint.
When you're living with rats, roaches, and things like that, that's deplorable. You cannot have that kind of stuff with children running around in a building that may be full of lead.
And not coincidentally, people of color have higher incidences of certain cancers, asthma, and heart disease. And housing segregation in policing. Housing segregation means we are having vastly different experiences with crime and vastly different experiences with policing. Because our neighborhoods are so segregated, sometimes racial profiling can be camouflaged as spatial profiling, where living in certain areas can make you more likely to be stopped by the police. And it means that people have a lot of unnecessary contact with the criminal justice system just because of where they live.
The problem in our city, the police and the citizens are fighting. They keep targeting my brothers and sisters who don't really have nothing.
And that heavy, aggressive kind of policing that you see in Black neighborhoods in particular makes people feel like they can't trust the police. And when people don't trust the police, crimes go unsolved, and people have to find other ways to keep themselves safe. But of course, it's not just Baltimore, because housing segregation and discrimination fundamentally shape the lives of people in nearly every major American city. It really is in everything. To hear more about how race shapes American life, visit npr.org/codeswitch. I'm Gene Demby. Be easy.
again. I'm glad we all got to watch that. I think they did a really good job of explaining the history behind redlining and segregation, and how it not leaks, it is built into the fabric of this country to this day. If anyone has any questions, I know that was probably a lot to take in. So if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat, and we can talk about them now or in our open forum. So real quick, I want to mention the housing cost burden. In the context of homelessness and housing, cost burden is the word we use to describe when someone is spending over 30% of their income on housing. And that is bad for obvious reasons, because people have other expenses. People have to pay for medical costs, transportation, tuition, all the things, all the bills that are required. And so spending 30% of your income on housing is a lot. Looking at this chart, we can see the percentage of households who are renters by race. And then the bullet points are the percentage of renters by race who experience higher rates of cost burden. And looking closely at it, I know it's kind of small, we can see that Black Americans make up 58% of renters in this country, and then 54, almost 55% of that 58% experiences a high rate of cost burden compared to their white counterparts. And then similarly in Hispanic communities, 53% of renters are Hispanic, and 53% of that 53% experience a high cost burden. And then I think you guys can see same with Asian and other minorities, and then the same with white renters. But we can see that Black and brown folks experience cost burdens at much higher rates than any of their other counterparts. Alrighty, so next we are going to get into systemic poverty, which describes how people of color are overrepresented in poverty relative to their representation in the overall population. And this is a direct result of numerous economic, political, and social systems. I'm going to go over this one pretty quickly, just because if I didn't, I would be talking for days. Poverty and race are such extremely interconnected and intersectional issues that are also incredibly complex, that I will save that can of worms for another workshop another day. So stay tuned. But really quick, looking at this chart, we can see the disproportionate rates of poverty that Black and Hispanic communities experience. Right here, we can see that the light blue bars are percent of total population, and the dark blue ones of poverty population. Basically what that means is that if the darker bar is taller than the light blue bar, then that is negatively disproportionate. We can see that Black people make up 13%, like I said earlier, of the total population, and yet they make up nearly 24% of the poverty population. That is disproportionate. Same with Hispanic communities. They make up 18.7% of the total population, and yet they make up almost 28% of the poverty population. And then, like the other chart we saw earlier, that disproportion is reversed when we look at white and Asian communities. Yeah. Let me see. Did I miss something? Yeah, and then same points with the last chart that we saw earlier. If things were proportionate, the dark blue bars would be the exact same height as the light blue ones. That is what proportionate means. And in a perfect world, in a perfect place, there would be no dark blue bars at all, because there would be no poverty. And so it's really important to look at poverty rates when we think about homelessness, because poverty, and in particular deep poverty, is a very strong predictor of homelessness. Black and Latinx communities are overrepresented in poverty relative to their representation in the overall population, like I just said, and are most likely to live in deep poverty with rates of 10.8% and 7.6% respectively. And I think that's this slide. But yeah, I'm not going to get too deep into systemic poverty just because it is such a deep and complex issue that deserves its own time, as are all of the topics I'm talking about today. But I think this one would be especially lengthy in particular. Cool. Next, we're going to talk about the prison to homelessness pipeline. And MSP actually had a really, really great community forum on this topic a couple of weeks ago, and we had some really cool speakers. And the recording is up on YouTube if anybody wants to watch it. I will drop the link in the chat. But yeah, we had a really great forum, and if you would like to watch it, I would highly recommend it. It's about an hour long. But anyways, what is the prison to homelessness pipeline? As a result of systemically racist law enforcement and justice system, Black and brown individuals are more likely to become incarcerated than any other race. Pipeline. Next step in the pipeline, formerly incarcerated individuals are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness. The next slide. Getting into specifics, I think this chart is pretty self-explanatory. It is from a study done by the Sentencing Project that found that Black folks are incarcerated at a rate of 1,400 per 100,000, while white people at 275. And that is a very, very stark difference that I would say tells of undeniable racism, systemic racism. Further breaking it down, Black men are most disproportionately affected by the criminal justice system. And we also cannot talk about this without also talking about how Black and brown folks are targeted by law enforcement and the justice system and are currently being incarcerated and arrested at rates disproportionate to any of their white counterparts, white or Asian counterparts, for the same crimes or no crimes at all. To add on to that, programs like cash bail, inaccessible legal aid, probation, and so many more only work to make these racial disparities worse. So formerly incarcerated people are nearly 10 times more likely to experience homelessness than the general population. In New York City alone, over 54% of individuals released from prison moved directly into a homeless shelter system. Why is that? This is kind of like an open question. If anyone out here can name a specific barrier that someone might face, feel free to share. I want to hear what y'all have to think, what y'all have to say. Feel free to use a chat or just unmute and speak your mind. Martin says stigma for housing or employment, and that is absolutely correct. If we skip to the next slide, we have more. Having to live with a family member, friend, or halfway house where they might have trauma in those places. These are all so correct. But yeah, another one, gentrification, because New York City has become so expensive. All wonderful points that are all correct. And I wish I could talk about every single thing that we're talking about today for an hour. But alas, I cannot. But anyways, on the slide, I have some of the barriers, but not all of them, obviously. Y'all just mentioned some that are not here. And there's so many more that I don't know about, to be honest, I don't know about. And there's so many that people experience, and people experience different things. And so not everyone experiences what I'm about to talk about, and not everyone's experiences line up, and that is how it is. But first, I have a severe lack of resources. There is a really severe lack of reentry resources or support for formerly incarcerated individuals after being in prison for a long period of time. People likely no longer have access to basic, things like an ID, a bank account, stable housing, transportation, and so many other things. We talked a lot about this at the forum, if you guys want to watch it. I know currently there is a assembly bill in California. I'm not sure exactly what number. I think there's a 7 in it. Martin, if you want to drop it, I know you know. There's currently an assembly bill in the California state legislature to have IDs be a part of the reentry process. And so once you leave prison, this program would ensure that you leave with an ID, which I would say is pretty necessary. Next, we have stigma. Like Martin said, the stigma that comes with being formerly incarcerated is often what prevents individuals from accessing the necessary opportunities to reenter society. This discrimination and isolation can also often lead to mental health issues as well as high recidivism rates. And recidivism is just the fancy word for going back to prison. Yes, AB 717. Martin dropped it in the chat if anyone's interested. But yeah, stigma is a huge, huge barrier, not only with formerly incarcerated individuals, but in, people experiencing homelessness in general. And I would say in almost any other social setting, there is stigma everywhere that often presents itself as a barrier. Next, I have application discrimination. Applications for housing, employment, often include questions about criminal history, felonies, credit checks, professional references, and these questions are usually created to target formerly incarcerated individuals and are typically grounds for whoever is looking at them to reject the application. And so if you think about it, how would somebody who has been in prison for the last 10 years have a professional reference, have a good credit score? And so that is just unrealistic. And I know there's a lot of efforts out there, like Ban the Box, which we talked about at our forum again, which is a initiative to ban the question on job applications, housing applications that are you a convicted felon? Because that is usually grounds for people to reject the application, and that should not stop someone from being able to attain stable housing. Finally, I have a loss of rights. Being a convicted felon or formerly incarcerated person, it depends on the situation. You can literally lose your rights. You can lose your right to vote. You can lose your right to travel abroad. You can no longer participate in jury duty. Employment in certain fields, you can't do that. Public social benefits and housing, and parental custody benefits. Those no longer apply to you in many cases. In addition to not being allowed to serve on a jury, though, convicted felons are not allowed to apply for federal or state grants, live in public housing, Social Security, food stamps, things like that are stripped from formerly incarcerated people, in this case, specifically felons. If you guys want to learn more about this, I highly encourage y'all to watch the forum again. But cool. Last major section that we're going to talk about today is access to healthcare. Oftentimes, a lack of mental or physical health care is the reason one might initially be experiencing homelessness. And once experiencing homelessness, it can also be one of the biggest barriers in escaping homelessness. This section is a pretty fat one. Not gonna lie, it's especially prevalent right now. We're seeing in the pandemic, obviously, COVID-19. I know I said we weren't going to talk about it. I lied. But we're going to start off by talking about some of the healthcare inequalities that have existed for a long time. Pre-COVID just existed. And we're going to start off with health status. Communities of color, particularly Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities, disproportionately experience pre-existing conditions. And these are typically incredibly serious conditions like diabetes, asthma, cancer, and so many others. And the reason that these pre-existing conditions are disproportionately prevalent in communities of color is because of a whole host of factors like environmental racism, corrupt politics, economics, and a bunch of systems that work together that create an environment where communities are overexposed to things like food insecurity, pollution, poor housing conditions, like we saw in the video, lead in the building. A lot of communities of color are located in places where they experience high levels of, air pollution and stuff like that. I don't know how many of us are in San Diego right now, but I know Barrio Logan has the highest levels of air pollution in the city due to the freeway being smack dab in the middle of it. And so that is a pretty relevant example of environmental racism and how it affects one's health status as a person of color. Next, we have work risks. Many people of color and immigrants work on the front lines of essential industries like healthcare, grocery stores, food delivery, agriculture, and things like that, where they are more likely to be exposed to various illnesses. I think this is especially, we've seen this especially right now in the pandemic, but even not in the pandemic, this is still a issue. Only 16% of Latinx workers and 20% of Black workers have the ability to work from home, as opposed to 30% of white workers who have that option open to them. Next slide. Next, we have insurance and quality healthcare. Fear, distrust, and discrimination can also discourage some communities of color from seeking out medical assistance. Immigrant families, particularly those who are undocumented or of mixed status, may choose not to go to the hospital for fear of immigration enforcement. Historical and present oppression in the healthcare industry has also led to distrust in the healthcare field among Black communities. And everything that I just said is incredibly serious. And I could talk about it for days. But I think the main takeaway is that the healthcare system was not built to serve communities of color. And that is not cool. Overall, about 30 million people in this country are uninsured, and half of those people are people of color, which is, again, an insane disproportion. Next, we have geography. This one is one that you might not really think of when you think of inequities in healthcare, but rural areas face reduced healthcare access due to a shortage of hospitals. 120 rural hospitals have closed in the past decade. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If you live out in a place that's hard to access, hard to, fund, it makes sense that hospitals would be one of the places that experience shortages. And that is not okay because everybody deserves healthcare. Next, we have stigma. I know I talked about stigma earlier, but specifically in healthcare, communities of color often experience many stigmas regarding healthcare, and more specifically mental health care, that make it extremely difficult to access care. And sometimes I know from my personal experience, a lot of this stigma can be internal, it can be within the community. A lot of immigrant cultures just don't think of healthcare like that. And it is unfortunate, but it should be a more accessible option and it should be destigmatized because mental health care is healthcare, just like physical health care. Next slide. Alrighty, so this is gonna get into the COVID-19 impacts on health inequities. There isn't too much on this just because it is currently still happening, so we don't really have, solid information on it yet. But I'm sure that when it comes out, we will probably not like what we see. So these existing health inequities that I just talked about are made worse by the pandemic, as many people of color are forced to choose between wages and protecting their health, and have been reduced access to health care should they become sick. Higher rates of pre-existing conditions make individuals more vulnerable to catching the disease or experiencing a more extreme case of it. And like I said, a lot of communities of color experience disproportionate rates of pre-existing conditions, which obviously makes COVID so much worse. It makes COVID fatal sometimes. But a point that I forgot to make earlier is that all of the inequities that I mentioned previously, all 5 of them, they are not all of the ones that exist. There are so many more out there that I probably don't know about, just because there are so many. And it is our job to learn about as many of them as we can. Next slide. And then here are just some stats that we have been able to attain as COVID-19 impacts. The first one is the Navajo Nation has an infection and death rate per capita 10 times higher than that of Arizona, which is right next to them. And that is clearly disproportionate and racist. Next, we have in Chicago, Black residents make up 60% of the deaths due to COVID-19, while making only 29% of the general population. And that is obviously a huge disparity. And also racist again. In New York City, the COVID-19 mortality rates of Latinx and Black populations are about twice those of white and Asian population. And all of these three things, as we can see, they're just extensions of the inequities that we have been seeing and that were built into the healthcare system and built into this country on purpose because someone wanted them there. That is, those people are not us, but they currently still exist. Next slide. Alrighty, it is almost 6:50. I said we'd have 10 minutes for open discussion at the end, and I was right. But really quick, I have some closing words. Like in general, as like a conclusion, there exists a inherently and intentionally racist system that detrimentally affects those it was created to oppress and underserve. Today we discussed the many ways in which this system creates disproportionate rates of homelessness in BIPOC communities, but that is just one of the many complex systemic racial injustices that exist. And I know we broke that one issue down into 4, but there are way more than 4 parts to why different races experience homelessness at disproportionate rates. I know this looks like a lot of words. I literally copy and pasted what I put in the beginning just because I really wanted to hammer home the fact that I know we talked a lot about systems today. I know we blame the system for a lot of things, but it's so important to remember that, again, these systems did not sprout from the earth themselves. They're not made from the wind. They're carefully and intentionally, purposefully crafted by human beings for many reasons. And I don't want to get into those reasons because I will be angry. But they exist and they are in place, and they continue to remain in place because they are upheld by people who benefit from it. And that group of people is a minority, I would say. I would say, yes, I would say that as a fact. That group of people is a minority, and that oftentimes, most of the time, their benefits are reaped from the backs of other people that they oppress. And this is important, like I said earlier, because while we can blame all of these injustices on corrupt systems, these systems are, by definition, put in place by people. And when we make this connection, we can see that systems themselves are not responsible, and that blaming an elusive concept of a system won't do us much good, but focusing on the institutions and the people that intentionally create these things and enforce their existence and uphold the racist and discriminatory practices within them, that is where it's at. But on the bright side, like I said earlier, I know I'm just repeating myself. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I will because it's important. On the bright side, because these systems were created by people, it means that people like us have the ability to be like, hey, that's whack. Let's create a better one. And so I think that is the goal. And I hope that for those of us who have the capacity to do so, we feel empowered and supported as a part of the MSP family. I know not all of us here are a part of MSP, but if you aren't, you should be. And if you can't, then hit me up and we can just talk. But yeah, that is pretty much it from me. We got 7 minutes for y'all to share your thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, criticisms, anything that I might have missed that is important. But yeah. Let me check the chat.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we can see all your lovely faces. I don't know about you all, but I feel very empowered after all of these workshops. Cecily,
she's working on a self-portrait series at a gallery downtown. Yeah, he's gonna see her face, more of her.
Oh.
Is that okay with you, Guy? Yeah, sorry, I guess I just...
As a reminder, please go ahead and mute yourself. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. But again, Cecily, you really talked about racism and homelessness in such an amazing light, and I always feel very empowered after hearing you speak. So thank you so much for this workshop. And yeah, if anyone has questions, comments, concerns, we have about 8 more minutes. So go ahead and throw them in the chat, unmute yourself, do your thing.
And if anyone wants access to like the slides or anything, feel free to just shoot or Geeker an email. There it is. Anyone has anything to say? Now is the time. I'm guessing me and Geetha will stick around a little past 7 if you guys want to talk. But yeah, now is your time. If not, I am going to continue the tunes and we can listen to some music until someone wants.
I just had a quick little comment that I want to add on. I don't know if you guys have watched it or not, but I just watched this YouTube video and it's called Slavery by Another Name. If any of you guys are interested in watching it, it's like a mini documentary and it talks about how the prison system developed from slavery and how then the prison system was used basically just for free labor and how that is the whole foundation of our system today. And it was super informative, brought up a lot of points that I hadn't learned about, so I can link it in the chat if you guys want it to.
That would be awesome. I would love to watch it if you would link it in the chat. I think a lot of people here would like to watch it. Yeah, I think in my head, I see the systemic racism in this country as not different types of racism, but the same thing, just evolved. Just evolved over centuries. It's shown itself in different forms, whether that be in slavery, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, what Esmeralda was talking about, free labor through prisons, because apparently that is legal slavery. But just things like that, I think, are important to connect to their history because that is where they come from.
Totally. In the chat, I am seeing a book about redlining called The Color of the Law. Thank you so much for that. If anyone is interested in learning more about redlining, The Color of the Law is a good resource for you. Does anyone else have any comments, questions? All righty, I think I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording now. But thank you all so much for coming tonight. Like Cecily said, we will be hanging out with some music, and feel free to stick around and talk to us afterwards, or feel free to enjoy the rest of your evening. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight.
Y'all have a good night, friends.